normally, when there are moderators for these events, they say, we want to introduce our speakers, but of course, as you know, the speaker does not need a long introduction. In my case, I will say our speakers are amazing and we will have a wonderful, wonderful conversation. And I don't want to bore you with all the amazing awards they have gotten. Suffice it to say that if you have seen any of their films, you've fallen in love with their films and you've seen all of their films on long weekends. I know a lot of the people in this room, and I know we haven't watched The Wind That Shakes the Barley once, but maybe 3, 4, 5 times. And we still watch it. So, without further ado, I want to get us started, and I think Paul and Ken just came from a very wonderful speaking engagement at the Lightbox, and I wanted to ask you guys how that went and what happened there.
Yes. Well, first of all, thanks for asking us to come. It's a real pleasure, and it's probably going to be the nicest thing we've done in the last few days. So. The other thing, yes, the meeting at the Lightbox was interesting because we had a conversation with Michael Moore, and he was I have to say he was terrific. He was, when we hadn't met before properly, and he was very unassuming and a very genuine guy, and we had a really good conversation with him. And we'd been contacted a couple of days earlier by the Justice for Janices campaign. And they had an interesting story to tell us, that the company employed by the film festival in the Lightbox was a non-union company that was paying below the proper wages and that was in trouble for, or allegedly, sacking people against the law. So we were very pleased to be able to ask one of the organisers, a guy called Diego, to come up on stage and to explain to the audience why, when the film festival was not behaving properly, they should kick out Impact and get a union-organised company. I'm not sure it was entirely popular, but they took it in good part, and we await developments.
Perhaps you could drop them a line, let them know what you think. Yeah.
So you're both here with the film Root Irish. Your latest one, it just premiered yesterday in Toronto. It's about Iraq. So how did you come to the decision to make a film about Iraq, and what's the difference? Recently we've seen so many films come out about Iraq from Hollywood. What's the difference in the film that you guys have made?
Well, the reason we wanted to make it, obviously, and I'm sure like everybody else in this room, it's just the scale of the tragedy is just almost unimaginable. You know, 1.3 million people that the Lancet magazine have estimated that have died as a result of the occupation, the dislocation, the mutilation, the 4 million people who are refugees, and so it's obviously galling for us to realise that our government has been part of it. That Tony Blair followed George Bush into this war, an illegal war, with it, and much of the population was against it. So it's always something that Ken and myself have been talking about for a long time, but you can't simply write a story to order. You have to find a way into it. You have to find a spark. You have to find the human path into it. But we thought it was a very rich backdrop. And so in our research, we talked to many soldiers, and in the course of this, we realised that something very, very interesting was going on, because there were many contractors who had been to Iraq as well. And we began to realise that really this occupation and this invasion could not have happened without this massive contribution from private contractors. And what was really happening was the privatisation of war. And these people are not answerable to any Minister of Defence, not answerable to any army hierarchy, but they're only answerable to a boss, and they're only interested in shareholders who want to make a profit out of it. And believe me, billions have been made out of it. And so in the course of this, we really thought that perhaps the protagonist might be someone who was an ex-soldier and who was a contractor, and we could try and tell the story through that. But it was also very, very important to us too that the story should have an Iraqi element to the story. So there's a very important character in it who is a refugee from Iraq in Britain, and then he becomes a very important voice, a very important part of the film.
Yeah.
Just
Can you hear me at the back?
I can't hear us.
Only just.
Okay.
Just,
Okay.
it's not the accent then, no?
I think one. I mean, the number of traps waiting for you if you're going to do films about Iraq. I mean, one trap that I would, tentatively suggest that a number of films have fallen into is that it's seen as a tragedy, but seen as an American tragedy. And the main characters, turn out to be Americans, and they have problems, and it's their tragedy. And the difficulty we had was because we're not, obviously, not Iraqis, we don't know the language, we don't know the culture, we go as tourists. And that, but nevertheless, we wanted to leave the audience with a feeling that as Paul said, it's the over 1 million people have died, it's the 4 million people displaced. That's the tragedy. That's the tragedy. So that was a kind of knotty problem to try and resolve. But also, I guess we wanted to reignite people's anger, because when the war was, before it was fought and when it was being announced, and when it began, there were millions of people, literally millions of people on the streets. I mean, we had 2 million in London, and I know there were big demonstrations here and across the States. And then, there's talk amongst the right-wing press of Iraq fatigue, and like it's something we shouldn't get to. It's we move on, they say. Time to move on. Well, we don't think so. These are war criminals who have committed this, and quite clearly they should stand trial for what they've done. The tragedy of Iraq is just overwhelming. It's on a scale that, it's unimaginable. And for us to think our government and the Labour Party, an apparently left-wing party, should be part of this is just horrific. So, never mind the breaches of international law, the breaches of the Geneva Convention, the torture, the extradition, the lies, the falsification. So all that, we wanted to reignite people's anger, because we can't move on. We can't move on. We have to stay. And anger can be productive. So I think it's really important that we keep that sense of injustice about the terrible crime that was committed.
In programming for TPFF this year, there were many films on Gaza. But what we saw in watching many of them was there were foreign cameras going into the Gaza Strip and filming for long periods of time just massacres and bodies. You've dealt in your film with Arabs and Iraqis, and you haven't portrayed them in that way. How did you deal with that in the making of the film, to try and not do the stereotypical way Arabs are portrayed in these films all the time?
I mean, it was, Paul wrote some very good characters, really. I think that was the secret. There's a presence in the film of an Iraqi musician who acts as a translator and also has a song. And so his presence, I mean, his is probably the one voice, that you respect above all others. His music speaks of the situation of people in Baghdad. And we also used actuality footage of incidents within the war that are clearly real documentary, so you can't gainsay it. I mean, there's images of the Americans like killing as in a video game, lining them up with a square on them, somebody presses a button, the person is dead. I mean, those images exist, they're real images, so they're included. So that one has a sense of the violence and a sense of the catastrophe.